Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this very special event. I'm Vice Provost Mark Todd, and on behalf of the USC Provost, Michael Quick, I'd like to welcome you to our program this evening, Democracy and Sacrifice, the Meaning of Military Service in America. In a few days, our country will pause and observe Veterans Day, honoring those women and men who have served in the U.S. military. Military service during wartime is one of many forms of public service in America, yet it's distinct in that the scope and scale of sacrifice can often be transformative for the individuals involved, in both physically visible and in unseen ways. War changes everyone involved, and we've been at war for over 14 years continuously, the longest period of war in America's history. As our nation pauses to celebrate Veterans Day next week, we here at USC will take this evening to reflect on the meaning of service and sacrifice in this great democracy that we all share. I'd like to take a moment and recognize the generous contributions of the sponsors who've made this evening possible. The California Resources Corporation has been a long-standing supporter of the USC student veterans. In partnership with USC Sports Properties, the CRC honors student veterans of the game at every home football game. The CRC has helped to fund the USC Veterans Resource Center, and they continue to search for new ways to honor the military and veterans in our USC community. I'd also like to thank the Price School of Public Policy for supporting this evening's event. The Saul Price School is not only home to our USC ROTC programs, but they're also tireless supporters of our student veterans. And last but not least, I'd like to thank the Master of Business for Veterans program at the USC Marshall School of Business. The MBV program is truly the first of its kind graduate program. It's designed to leverage the management and leadership skills of its student veterans, which they've gained during military service, and further develop them so that the veterans can continue to serve their communities as future business leaders. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our special guests this evening. Professor Kevin Starr is a university professor and professor of history and policy planning and development. From 1962 to 1964, he served in the U.S. Army as a lieutenant in the 68th Armor of the 18th Infantry in what was then West Germany. He went on to earn an MA in 1965 and a PhD from Harvard in American Literature. And in 1973, he earned a Master's of Library Sciences from UC Berkeley. He served as California State Librarian from 1994 to 2004, when Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger named him State Librarian Emeritus. Professor Starr is the author of the ongoing multi-volume history of California, collectively entitled Americans and the Californian Dream. The first volume of the series, Americans and the California Dream 1850 to 1915, was published in 1973. His most recent volume, which covers the period from 1950 to 1963 and entitled Golden Dreams, California in an Age of Abundance, won the 2009 Los Angeles Times Book Prize for History. And now our honored guest this evening, General David Petraeus, is a partner with the global investment firm KKR. He's chairman of the KKR Global Institute and a Judge Widney professor here at USC. Prior to joining KKR, General Petraeus served for over 37 years in the U.S. military, including command of coalition forces during the surge in Iraq, command of U.S. Central Command, and command of coalition forces during the surge in Afghanistan. Following his service in the military, General Petraeus served as director of the Central Intelligence Agency. General Petraeus graduated with distinction from the U.S. Military Academy in 1974. He was a top graduate in the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College class of 1983, and subsequently earned a PhD from Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. He's received numerous U.S. military, State Department, NATO, and United Nations medals and awards, and has a number of honorary degrees. He's also been decorated by 13 foreign countries. General Petraeus also serves as a visiting professor at the City of New York's Macaulay Honors College, as a senior fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center, as the Senior Vice President of the Royal United Services Institute, as co-chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations Task Force on North America, and as an advisory board member from numerous veterans organizations and think tanks. So please join me in welcoming General Petraeus and Professor Kevin Starr.
Those were marvelous introductions that we had in terms of the themes tonight. And I think we could break down the themes to some of the bullet points, really, the lesson plan that we're always taught in the Army, the responsibility of command, calling others to sacrifice, and the cost of military victory, being hard fighting, and that at all levels, what the implications of those are, and the return to civilian life, and new ways to serve, remembering and forgetting the wars, which of course is very much on American minds these days after those 14 years of war continuing. Now, if you're being a PhD from Princeton and a lover of American history, is there any one general, any one commander, any one fellow, maybe West Point graduate with you, not necessarily that is in your mind as a paradigm, as a model?
There are a number of individuals by whom I was privileged to be mentored, in fact. But I continually come back to General Grant. I thought he displayed extraordinary qualities. We'll talk about some of those. He's a paradoxical figure because he'd not succeeded in civilian life in virtually anything he'd tried. He'd been quite impressive in the Mexican War in his early years, but then got out and really didn't do much at all. He tried a number of different pursuits and never, certainly not only did not strike it rich, barely made ends meet, and then emerges as an extraordinary leader. And one, our country, I think, has been very fortunate at different times to have the right man, the right woman at the right place at the right time, starting with the Founding Fathers. And what a different place this would be if it hadn't been for Jefferson, Madison, and above all, of course, Washington, and a number of others. And I think, frankly, that Grant emerges as the man of the hour in the Civil War, certainly in uniform, noting that Abraham Lincoln was extraordinary above all. Just truly exceptional. If I could, I probably should back up, though. And I do want to just say thanks to Mark for a very kind introduction and for organizing this, and Matt, my special assistant here, who pulled a lot of this together. Professor, I'm very grateful to you for doing the interview tonight. It's not often that you get interviewed by somebody who has the National Humanities Medal and is also Arnold's librarian.
The two are not contradictory.
No, I'm trying to get my head around this here. I'm sure one is related to the other. Look, then, of course, thanks to the Price School, my school, where I am a Judge Widney professor. Thanks to California Resources. I might add, was not mentioned there, is that it is led by a West Point classmate of mine, and really quite an extraordinary individual. And to be building yet another firm at a time when oil prices have gone down by 55%, and to do it successfully is no small task, and they're doing a great job with that, and to continue to support USC at the same time in the way that they have. So most of all, though, thanks to all of you for giving up your evening to hear an old soldier and an old professor ruminate on leadership in the Civil War and the contemporary times and thoughts about service and so forth.
When you were making your remarks about Grant's comeback, I was reminded that it was through volunteer forces, through the Illinois Volunteer, that brought him back. He was elected by his troops as colonel and then promoted to brigadier.
That's exactly right. And of course, he then ends up fighting one of the very first tactical successes of the war at Donelson, there in that land in the Cumberland River, Tennessee River area. And he's often shunted aside. You'll recall there are jealousies. The politics in the Civil War were just horrendous. There were political appointments of generals at various times. He gets stuck with a couple of them. The general coming out of the Tidewater, as I recall, was one of those. And they were shuffling the commanders of the overall army, although none of them really put his arm around the force until Grant really developed the strategy, the first real strategy when he took command overall. But you'll recall, I mean, they were so desperate that they did McClellan, and, you know, he had a case of the slows as Lincoln. I think Lincoln actually wrote a letter that said, if you're not going to do something with those troops, let me know. I'll do something with them. And does a fight and then retreats very quickly to Washington. He's replaced. You know, and a couple of leaders later, he's brought back, actually, and still has a case of the slows. He's a great-looking guy, Little Mac, they called him, very popular with the troops, an extraordinary, inspirational figure in that sense, and as you'll recall, ran for president, and almost could have won against Lincoln. It's not inconceivable that were it not for Sherman taking Atlanta and then Sheridan having the victory in the Valley right before the election, it's very possible that there could have been a very different outcome to the Civil War. Can we turn up the volume just a tad, by the way? I think there's some folks. We'll get that done.
Now, another second crucial moment or sequence is the Vicksburg campaign, which was Navy and Army integrated, the naval gunboats.
Yeah, the Vicksburg campaign is arguably one of the greatest operational level battles of all time. You'll recall that this was the citadel on the Mississippi. It was seen to be as impregnable, very, very good defenses, lots of cannons that could rake any ship that tried to run its guns. They tried everything to get to it. It was just very hard to get to. They even tried digging a canal to go around the Mississippi and get ships below it. They couldn't do that. They spent months trying this. And ultimately, Grant crafted a plan that they were going to run the guns of Vicksburg, get down south of Vicksburg, land on the shore. Grant was going to go all the way out and intercept, throw loose of his logistical lines of communication, intercept the force that was coming to reinforce the big citadel at Vicksburg, and deal with him, make sure he couldn't get to it, and then turn and invest Vicksburg with a siege. Really an extraordinary campaign. It was so risky that Grant's most trusted lieutenant, Sherman, insisted that a formal letter be put in the record saying that he felt this was too risky. Now, this is Grant and Sherman. I mean, these guys were like this. Grant, you know, Sherman was fond of saying that, you know, I stood by Grant when he was drunk and he stood by me when I was crazy. And they had this extraordinary relationship. And of course, it continued during the presidency when Sherman then ultimately becomes, I mean, Sherman, a famously irascible and really quite, had some very decidedly strange ways. I mean, he was the one, as I recall, that decided he didn't like the Army headquarters in Washington. I mean, who would? But so he moved it out to, I think, either to St. Louis or Fort Leavenworth or wherever it was. I mean, moves it out to the Midwest. Ostensibly, he says, to get closer to the Indian wars that were being fought at that time. But again, quite an extraordinary figure, and one who actually liked being under the umbrella of Grant. He actually had nervous issues, as you'll recall, had serious periods of depression at various points in his career, and liked that steady hand of Grant above him. And they together were an extraordinary team, really extraordinary.
You know, General, your opinion of Grant is so elevated, but historians have, in the past, have not always been so nice to Grant's reputation. And
true.
And first ladies like Mary Lincoln, for instance, favorably just said of Grant, he's a butcher and not fit to be the head of an army. Yes, he generally manages to claim a victory, but such a victory. He loses 2 men to the enemy's 1. He has no management, no regard for life. And I think that cliche sort of lasted for some time.
Well, it did for a variety of reasons. One, first of all, her math is a little bit off, as you recall, but he did have some battles where he lost more than did generally Lee's forces, that was the penultimate battle for the final part of the final year of the war, or thereabouts. But I think it was propagated even more. It was amplified by Southern historians in the mid to late 1900s, who were the proponents of the glorious lost cause. Douglas Southall Freeman, very respected historians by and large, but enormous admirers of General Lee, and put down Grant quite a bit. What's interesting is that in New York, you have Grant's tomb, the Grant Memorial. In fact, I'm an honorary trustee of the Grant Memorial Association, and it's really an extraordinary location. And it was one of the leading tourist sites in the entire city for decades. He was such a famous and revered figure. Remember his, the funeral march and everything else, just extraordinary. By the way, the big joke in New York when I was growing up is they ask you, who's buried in Grant's tomb, and actually it's Grant and his wife Julia. But anyway, but Grant's tomb was a metaphor almost for the way the country regarded Grant. It became very run down during the late 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and it wasn't until, say, 2 decades or so ago that there was a major effort launched. I mean, it was graffiti covered, trash strewn, this magnificent monument. And he has, in fact, in it, there are the busts of all of his senior generals. Of course, Sherman and Sheridan, most prominent among them.
General, when you look back at Grant and his generals and the strategies that they chose, was there any other way to win this war than ultimately the one that Grant chose?
No, I don't think so. At the end of the day, you had to destroy Lee's army. That was the center of gravity of the Southern forces. There were other forces, but by the time Grant came west, by the time he was given command, he did the battles at Donelson. He went down and had not Vicksburg, bloody Shiloh. Shiloh, by the way, the very famous battle, that's the one where he almost was defeated. And the very first day, almost driven into the Tennessee River, was surprised. Sherman there with him, also surprised. And again, very nearly lost that day. But now, to give you a sense of the character of Grant, there he is, he's sitting that night. Anybody who's been, how many, by the way, have served, just out of curiosity? Well, thank you all very much for what you did in uniform and still do in uniform. Every now and then you have these miserable nights in the field, and all you're just trying to survive till daylight. You're just waiting. And Grant is sitting there. Every available shelter is being used as a makeshift hospital. The screams of those with amputations, the mourn on the battlefield of those who still have not been collected. And he's just sitting in an old chair under a tree with his slouch hat on. It's raining, and he's got a stub of a cigar in his mouth. And Sherman comes out of the dark, and he sees Grant. He pauses for a second, and then he says, "Well, General, we had the devil's own day today, didn't we?" And Grant says, "Yep, lick 'em tomorrow, though." Lick 'em tomorrow. I used that, by the way, on a number of occasions in Iraq and Afghanistan on seriously bad days. And it became lick 'em tomorrow. And that was the spirit. He was extraordinary in that regard. I mean, if you ask what are the attributes that really set him apart, I think the single biggest one, and what we always look for in senior commanders, by the way, is clarity of vision at the level of their command. He had clarity of vision at the tactical level. He had it at the operational level, Vicksburg, and then the campaign, and then Chattanooga again. He rescued that desperate situation. And then at the strategic level, when he was the first to have a true strategy. Remember, until he took command, no one had ever really imposed on that force, just took over and established a strategy. And he said, okay, Sherman is going to come over. He'd been in Chattanooga, they'd won that battle. He's going to go to Atlanta and then go to the sea and Savannah and then turn north. You've got a force coming out of the Tidewater trying to get south of Richmond if it can to cut the lines of communication from the south to Richmond. You've got Meade headed straight at Lee, and of course Grant is right in his back pocket. And you have Sheridan coming down the valley and for the first time taking away the granary of the South, just stripping it clean. This was total war now. And actually taking away that area which was used to threaten Washington, as you'll recall, and all the way up to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, earlier. And Grant and Meade, they hit Lee the first time in the Wilderness, and instead of backing up, as every commander had before, he just sidesteps to the left and hits him again. And the troops cheered when they saw that they weren't going to retreat to Washington because they knew this is what it was going to take to end the war. They had to destroy Lee's army. And by the way, it was not destroying the capital. They actually did take Richmond. Lee escaped and was still intent on fighting on. So he had this strategy. And if I could, one other that he was so extraordinary, there are 4 tasks of a strategic leader that I've developed in my sort of theory of leadership. The first is to get the big ideas right, get the strategy right. So same in the surge in Iraq. We can talk about that later. So he got this right. He got the idea of a strategy. He determined what he was going to do. And by the way, then he has this incredible determination. Remember, he writes back to Lincoln and says, I'm going to fight it out all summer on this line if that's what it takes. And he had to fight all summer, all fall, all winter, and most of the spring until April 1865 in Appomattox Courthouse. But you get the strategy right, then you have to communicate it effectively through the breadth and depth of the organization. Now keep in mind, in those days, you wrote your own orders. There's no big staff like I had, I'd give my fuzzy intent and some great guy, Rhodes Scholar, would turn it into a work of art. He wrote all of his own orders, and he would sit at a camp table and he'd write, and then he'd just slide it off on the floor and he'd write another one. And he wrote beautifully. His memoirs, for example, just genius, arguably the most literate memoirs of any senior officer. Very clear, very direct, very forthright.
Compared to Caesar's Gallic Wars.
Extraordinary, really are. And so he just writes, so he communicated, again, his intent, his strategy. And by the way, you have to keep all this in your mind. He didn't have digital maps. He didn't even have really decent maps. He's keeping all this in his mind, and he's giving the orders to everyone what they're going to do. And then they'd go to aides, and they'd either go on the telegraph or they'd be carried, if they're on an actual battlefield in the earlier stages when he was lower, directly to the generals being an aide in those days was risky business because you were carrying these orders out all over the battlefield. And then you have to oversee the execution of the big ideas. You have to oversee their implementation. And this requires your personal presence, the decisive point on the battlefield, your personal presence at the key gatherings of the commanders, the war councils, the determining how you're going to spend your time. You got to keep the president informed as well. You got to keep others. You're dealing with endless politics, even in the force at that time. And then you have to determine how to refine the big ideas and then do it all over again and just keep doing it. And again, I think that concept applies in business. It applies in any organization where somebody is setting the direction for it. Got to get that big ideas right, communicate it, oversee the implementation, refine it, and do it all over again. He was extraordinary at that. And it's, again, as I mentioned, paradoxical that this individual who failed as a farmer, who failed as a shopkeeper, who failed in so many different civilian pursuits, some just sheer unlucky, but some just he didn't have it, turns out to be one of the great generals of all time, not just one of the great generals of our
You mentioned, General, that when he said he was going to go to Richmond, the troops cheered. I've always thought it was interesting. It wasn't just irrelevant that General Grant, as Lieutenant General, wore the uniform of a private with his Lieutenant General stars, but what was his rapport with the rank and file, with the soldiers, with the NCOs, with the
There was enormous respect for him, and it's interesting because he was not a cheerleader, he was not a backslapper, he was very, very measured. I don't even know if that was, the uniform was something that he thought long and hard about. And, decided, this is how the troops will love me, or, some of these guys, really do this kind of stuff, they'd wear a suit in Iraq with desert boots or something like that. I mean, if they really thought this through. I think he just you know, that's what he put on. Yeah, and so he was not. There weren't great affectations. You know, as a leader, I mean, I tried all kinds of little tricks and gadgets and could cheerlead, could do this, could do that. I think, in fact, my view is on leadership that you have to employ whatever style is appropriate to get the most out of the individuals who work directly for you, and then the most out of the organization collectively. That style is different. I mean, when you're leading the CIA, which is an extraordinary organization, brilliant people, extremely full of initiative and everything else, as opposed to, say, an infantry platoon where it's, you know, you're up on the PT stand saying, yeah, let's do this thing, like we're going to do with the ROTC cadets tomorrow when we run the Coliseum again. But they loved him. And of course, you know, after the war, he was an international celebrity. Yeah. And I must say, I think he did actually enjoy that, as you know, and he loved New York. We all love New York. It's a pretty extraordinary place, and it was then as well. He did the world tour.
He took the tour of Europe that Benjamin Franklin invited Washington to take, but Washington didn't take it.
Yes, and again was, you know, received by kings and queens and princes and prime ministers and everything else, deservedly so. And tragically, as you know, he was given extraordinary gifts. In those days, I don't think there were any regulations on what you couldn't, you know, that if it was more than $33.90, you had to give it to the Government Services Administration. So he actually, as I recall, I think he actually sold them later when, remember, his investment went broke, and he owed enormous amounts of money. And that's why he wrote his memoirs.
With Mark Twain helping him to get it published.
Mark Twain helped get it published and encouraged him and so forth, but it was his writing. And he'd discovered that he liked it. Remember he did a couple of magazine articles, which I think Mark Twain arranged. There was some money in that, but the book ultimately was an extraordinary bestseller. I actually have a first edition of it. My mother found in a...
Before we get to the President General, since you obviously have a love for the memoirs, he spends about a third of the time talking about the Mexican War when he was a young officer and all the different...
Yeah.
And you meet the cast of characters.
It was very formative.
Yes.
Lee was a hero of the Mexican... You know, of course, all these guys were in the U.S. Army uniform at that time. And you find the future leaders of the Civil War, in many cases, were there, although there were obviously others that came on later. And, you know, he had these very rapid promotions if someone proved himself. First of all, there were just terrible losses. This is an era where, you know, you just marched straight at the enemy in some cases, and the leaders were up front. And it was miraculous that some of them survived as long as they did. But you think of all those that were lost during that war.
I think a transition, sir, to the president could be taking a look at Grant's philosophy of unconditional surrender, and they called him, didn't they?
They did, yeah. And it's interesting because if you really look at the terms that were agreed at Appomattox, these were quite magnanimous. But of course, Lincoln was still in office at that time, and you'll recall that, of course, Lincoln is killed within a few days of Appomattox. Grant was supposed to be in that box that night, and for some reason ended up going elsewhere. And I guess it's a few weeks later, Sherman takes the surrender of yet another one of the generals. Again, the war was essentially over, but you still had these other armies out there in the South. Sherman takes the surrender of one of them, and his was too magnanimous to Johnson's liking. And now you start this tug of war that ultimately erupts and also into the whole Reconstruction.
General, how do lessons of Grant's command experiences in the American Civil War translate to today's war? Certainly, unconditional surrender is not a common category today. Far from it.
No, in fact, you know, I mean, we'd all love to replay endlessly, you know, Operation Desert Storm, beat up in it was the fourth largest army in the world until we took it down a few notches, but you know, it pounded it for weeks from the air, and then in 100 hours just turned the fourth largest army into, I don't know, the 8th or 10th largest, and went home to a victory parade. I mean, a decisive victory, really extraordinary. Threw them out of Kuwait, liberated Kuwait. And that's not the kinds of wars that that we've been engaged in, certainly since 9/11, nor have we been engaged in many other cases since World War II. If you look at Korea, ends up with the demilitarized zone, but a sense of no end, if you will, and of course still tens of thousands of U.S. forces there. Certainly not combat, but on a demilitarized zone, staring, face to face. And then Vietnam, obviously, very long war. But, Afghanistan is now the longest war in our history. We won it in 2001.
You're responsible for a major military doctrine that historians will be writing about for many, many years to come, the surge. What were the intellectual, obviously the practical reasons, your experience as a commanding officer, but was your thinking moving in that direction prior over the course of your career?
Yeah. I was very fortunate to, first of all, just to have sort of an avocation for some of this. I'd stumbled into the French history in Indochine, as they called it, Indochina. There were a couple of very, very impressive figures in that era. General Bijard is one of them. He was the Lieutenant Colonel Paratroop Battalion Commander, 5 years in combat in Indochina alone, then later in Algeria. The British in Oman, the British in Malaya, all these different, there's something fascinating about those to me. And then I was very fortunate when I was teaching at West Point, in between the first and second years that I was there, to be asked to come down to Southern Command. General Galvin, brilliant soldier, scholar, statesman, just passed away tragically a few weeks ago. Ultimately was the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, and I worked for him there as well. But he brought me down to be a speechwriter, basically, for the summer. It was an extraordinary experience. I mean, we were at war, and I remember sitting in the first morning update, and I just went out, whoa, man. I mean, we got a war on in El Salvador. We're doing something to the Nicaraguans. I'm not sure what it's all about because we don't talk about it, but there's something going on there. There's the Contras. There's an insurgency in Colombia. We got the one in Peru. I mean, all throughout that, it was a theater at war with little attention being paid to it, frankly, because the focus was always on NATO, Warsaw Pact, and so on, the Soviet, American. And here you had a national plan for El Salvador that the U.S. had helped to design, a brilliant President Duarte executing. I actually got to meet him, in fact, a couple of times. We went into El Salvador. An incredibly dangerous place. If anyone tried to pass us in a vehicle, they would shoot the tires out of the car. I mean, I walked around with I had a little OD map case. It had an MP5 submachine gun in it, and I took it into their version of the Oval Office, and I thought, oh my God, there was no metal detector, but if they ever find out, and then I saw the other guys across every time they opened their jacket, I mean, there were all kinds of things stuck in it. So this was an unbelievable experience. I mean, this is a peacetime army that, there was in, we hadn't had Grenada yet, so we'd done nothing since Vietnam in any real sense. Way prior to Panama and Desert Storm. And then I did Haiti. I was fortunate to do a fellowship instead of doing the War College. I was at Georgetown. One of the reasons I went was because I thought, man, if something happens, I can get out of a fellowship a lot easier than I get out of the War College. And lo and behold, they relieved the operations officer for the UN force in Haiti 2 months before it's going to take over. And I knew the commander down there. And he called up and said, hey, how would you like to do Haiti instead of studying Haiti? And I said, I'm your man, so I deployed to Haiti and put together the UN force. And there developed some of these ideas about living with the people. Because when we took over from the US force, the US was only in the two major cities, Port-au-Prince and Cap-Haitien. And we decided, really I think I did actually, I was the operations chief, that we had to get out into the countryside. What we'd had before was just the special forces out there. They weren't enough. So we literally went out and built base camps for all of the coalition units coming in from Pakistan and Bangladesh and the Netherlands and a host. It was an incredible coalition of countries and a great, great experience in that regard. And then a few years after that, did Bosnia for a year as a one-star. And that was a great experience. Even though it was peacekeeping and we were several years into it, we had a very well developed, it was called the multi-year roadmap. And it had lines of operation. There we had civilians doing lots of the, say police training or justice or governance building and all the rest of that. But in Iraq, ultimately, we actually took the MERM, the multi-year roadmap, just put it, he said, use this as a template, recognizing that we're going to have to do the stuff that these different civilian, the UN organization or some of the other international organizations in Europe were doing. We are going to have to do it. And I think all of these really helped a great deal. And I did my dissertation on lessons the military took from Vietnam on the use of force. So it wasn't truly counterinsurgency focused, but inevitably you had to do a lot on that. And so I had this fascination with that. And you may recall that after the second tour in Iraq, I did the first tour as a division commander of the great 101st Airborne Division for the fight to Baghdad, extraordinary experience. And then the first year, and we went up to Mosul, and we used all these techniques then, and it was seen as a place what right looked like. And went back and actually ended up going right back over pretty quickly, and then stood up the train and equip mission, as it was called. That was about a 15-and-a-half-month tour. By the way, Secretary Rumsfeld had this wonderful way, your reward for doing a good deed is, at least one more good deed. I remember I was in Iraq, I was right at the end of the 15-and-a-half-month tour, having already done the 12-month tour without ever coming home that time. And he says, and he's actually patting me on the back. I mean, it was unbelievable. I said, here, get it really square right there. We're sitting in the car. He'd asked everybody to get out, and I felt really awesome. The Secretary of Defense is focused on me. And he said, yeah, you've done such a great job. I'd like you to come home through Afghanistan. I said, Afghanistan? So I ended up doing an assessment over there. But we went back, and I was at the Combined Arms Center. This is Fort Leavenworth. We called it the intellectual critical mass of the Army. And you oversaw something like 16 or 18 different schools and centers. All infantry school was one of them, all of them. And you owned the doctrinal field manuals, the Command and General Staff College, the Center for Army Leadership, the School of Command Prep for all the future battalion brigade commanders. An extraordinary, we called it the engine of change for the Army. And you controlled the scenarios in the combat training centers. And we just overhauled the entire road to deployment, or the road to war. It's about a 12-month schedule of activities for units going to war. And then we wrote the counterinsurgency field manual. And that was a great experience. We had about 15 months, because it really put together the thoughts that ultimately I used for the surge. And it was a series of big ideas.
This is amazingly comprehensive. Have you written this up, General?
I've done some of it, but not all of it. There are a couple, I've done 2 vignettes to illustrate, again, the duties of a strategic leader. One is on Iraq, and I talk about what the big ideas were, that you got to live with the people to secure them, and security is job one. By the way, that's a 180 reversal, because we were consolidating on big bases. The second was that we had to stop transition to the Iraqis. The policy was to transition faster. I said, we're going to retrograde transition. They can't handle it. We've got to take it back over. By the way, to live with the people, we had to fight to establish these operating bases. We did 77 additional locations just in Baghdad alone, and we had serious fights. We had a drill where we'd come in at last light, everything is loaded up. You have all the T-walls, because you had to have an entire cement fence around you when the sun came up in the morning, because they'd be running at you with suicide car bombs. Twice we had 2 of them hit us the following morning right away. And you had to, we had an observation tower with ballistic glass. That you'd have a crane that would pick it up, put it on the roof of the building. I mean, this was a real art form. And then we're going to promote reconciliation aggressively. You can't kill or capture your way out of an industrial strength insurgency, a whole host of these other. By the way, if you're going to reconcile with the reconcilables, because you want to help them be part of the solution instead of a continuing part of the problem, now you have the irreconcilables. And we went after them with Stan McChrystal's Joint Special Operations Forces even more. Then you got to communicate it through the breadth and depth of the organization. It's a huge effort. Your very first speech, your first huddle of the commanders. I wrote a letter to the troops the very first day. It's just endless. You're constantly doing, and you've got to do it up and out and with your partners, your coalition partners, your own chain of command, the Iraqis and so forth, and not all of my big ideas. By the way, all my big ideas were exactly contrary to what the National Security Advisor of Iraq, who I knew well from a previous tour, told me in the first week the prime minister was demanding what was essentially the opposite. And that's what Bush and Maliki had agreed to in November, just 2 months earlier, in Amman, Jordan, after the election, after Bush lost, really on Iraq. And I remember telling the National Security Advisor, this is my first week on the job, youngest four-star in the Army. All those above me basically had very mixed, would be charitable way to describe their views of the surge, at least. But there was one guy in my corner, and that was President Bush. And so I told the National Security Advisor, this is a sovereign country, an elected prime minister. If the prime minister wants to go in that direction, I would be very grateful if he would explain that to the president tomorrow in the normally scheduled video conference. I'll be there for it, as I always am. But he should know that if he chooses to do that, I will be on the next plane to Washington, and I will take the policy with me. Have a nice day.
General, I caught you were saying, it dovetails with the Grant question, when you wrote the troops. And you rose to high rank in an all-volunteer army, and that you belong to a generation of generals that came of age in those conditions. Yeah. So that when you developed and implemented the surge, how did you balance the knowledge that counterinsurgency strategy would likely require more sacrifice by American troops and their families back home with the doubts expressed, as you just suggested, by your chain of command, and chain of command being these civilians? I'm not questioning any.
Well, no, the military chain of command above me had advised against it. My predecessor advised against it. My boss, for the first couple of months,
it's a pretty lonely moment, then, isn't it? Really?
It actually can be a very lonely moment, and it's especially lonely when, as I predicted, and I told the Congress in my confirmation hearing, the Senate Armed Services Committee, it was going to get much worse before it got better, because I knew if we fought for these locations that we had given up before or had lost, that the enemy's going to fight us, and there are going to be higher casualties. And I knew that, and that's a tough, tough burden to bear. And you are the only four-star out there. You don't have any buddies. Every now and then somebody would drop by from some visit. But you have no peers, and that's tough. I remember the very first day of full command, we went out into Baghdad, into these neighborhoods that I'd known before, with huge armored escort and everything else. And it was so horrific. I just couldn't believe, actually, what had happened to some of them. They'd just been completely demolished, or there was even one case, tumbleweed blowing down the center of the street. And I'd remembered these thriving communities in my previous tours in Baghdad. And I went back and actually closed the door and put my head in the desk and said, what in the world were you thinking? Why did you take this on? You took it on because the president asked you to take it on, but no, this was tough. And again, as I said, for a number of months, and actually the boss that replaced my boss, who had advised against it, actually sent out a 2-star admiral, who had never been in Iraq, by the way, never served there, to determine how to do the drawdown plan. And he wasn't allowed to tell me what he was doing, and this is one of those where you have to demonstrate that you have the full range of emotions in a conversation with your boss. But, this is hard. It was hard. This is very, very hard. And again, casualties went up for 5 months or so, and thankfully, we knew it was going to turn. I really did believe that if we did what we knew we needed to do, and that we could do, that we would drive the violence down. And I knew how we would do it. And our guys knew. We'd been at this for a while. And it did. And thankfully, I think it was the 11 weeks prior to our testimony, the ambassador and I going back in September of 2007, violence went down by something like 50%. And so this was really statistically significant. This was a trend. And that's what saved the policy, by the way, because the policy had been hanging on a thread in the Senate in particular. We jokingly used to say, there were only 3 guys that still, we called them the 3 amigos. It was McCain, Lieberman, and Graham.
Not only the question of the things you bring up now, but the whole question of to what end. The Pentagon, for instance, announced last week, following the death of Army Master Sergeant Joshua Wheeler, that the United States is resuming combat operations in Iraq. Yeah. Early in the
Well, I think they did. I don't know if they said combat. There was some discussion.
Operations.
Pentagon saw it as combat, and I think some others saw it perhaps not as combat. But
Now, early in the Iraq War, 12 years ago, you asked the question, how does this end? And it was mentioned in the introduction of you that not only have you risen to high rank within a condition of a volunteer force, but you've risen to high rank in a condition of a 14-year continuous war, asymmetrical in so many ways.
Yep.
How would you answer this question now? How does this end?
By the way, I asked that question. I mean, I could tell right away in Iraq that this thing was it was a lot different than it was briefed. When we were in Kuwait, and again, I'm just a 2-star general at that time, it sounds grand, it's pretty neat in the division you command, but outside it, I mean, there's 3 stars, a couple 3 stars, and 4 stars, and everything else. So they had this big powwow in Kuwait before they brought us all back in from the desert floor. We're already deployed out in the desert floor, waiting for the word to go through the berm and attack into Iraq and head to Baghdad, 400 miles away or whatever it was. And I remember I realized this is just sort of foolish. I mean, just gather us all together, a little cheerleading speech. And so they said, anybody got any questions? I said, yeah, excuse me, I do. I said, can you tell me again what happens after we take Baghdad? And this retired 3-star who was in charge of the humanitarian relief, the organization, didn't last all that long, stood up and he knew me and he said, Dave, you just get us to Baghdad, we'll take it from there. And we got to Najaf, and we decided this is going to be the first big city. This is the holiest city in Shia Islam. 101st, we decided to take it down, to clear it. Big fight, several days, dropped bombs all over the place. Never nicked the Gold Dome Mosque, not even a nick, even though they were shooting right out from near it. So I called up my boss and I said, hey, where are those guys from ORHA, Office of Reconstruction Humanitarian Assistance? And so, we put a call in down there and they were still getting organized. And I realized this thing. So I had this guy riding in the back seat of my Humvee who had 3 Pulitzers at that time, Rick Atkinson, one of the great historians of all time in America. Got a couple more since then. And I just sort of asked out loud, tell me how this ends. Because it wasn't quite according to script very early on. And I think now how it ends, I'd like to think that it can end the way it ended when we actually left, if it had been sustained. We put Iraq in a very good place. Violence was down ultimately by, 90 or 95%. It was at a very sustainable level. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which then became Islamic State, had been destroyed, not just defeated. And tragically, after we pulled out our last combat troops, the Prime Minister, my partner, embarked on a campaign of such enormous sectarian activity that he alienated the very population that we'd worked so hard to bring back into the fabric of society, the Sunni Arab population in a Shia majority country. And once you do that, you've unhinged everything that we did. He went after the Sunni Arab vice president, literally right a day or two after our 4-star left. Ultimately went after the Minister of Finance, had no blood on his hands. We said that in writing, and a number of others, and then put down these peaceful demonstrations violently, and again, just undid everything. That created, again, fertile fields for the planting of the seeds of extremism. Al-Qaeda in Iraq reemerges as the Islamic State, drifts over into Syria, draws all kinds of power and weapons and money and everything else out of that, and then sweeps back in as a conventional force into Iraq. Tragic. I think that Iraq can stay together, though. I do think, by the way, that we are actually doing a bit better in Iraq than folks realize we are. I will predict that I think Ramadi, the capital of Anbar province, that we will retake that. This is the capital that we lost tragically some months back. Within a week or so, I think we're within 100 meters of the provincial headquarters in Ramadi. It's going to take further time. The real key in Iraq, though, is once again, it's politics in Baghdad. And if there are inclusive politics practiced that can bring all the parties back to the table and have a reasonable bargain between the center and the provincial capitals and the different elements in this very fractious country, I think you can keep Iraq together. I don't have any intellectual objection to the idea of Iraq breaking into Shiistan, Sunnistan, and Kurdistan. I do think those who put that forward, however, owe us an explanation of how we'd get there from here without having another bloodbath like Syria on our hands, because I fear that would be an all-out civil war. And I've never had it explained to me, who's going to draw the line, what happens to the mixed areas in which, there are 1 million people or more in mixed areas alone. And if you don't want another Syria on your hand, I think you try to keep Iraq together, but with a new political bargain between Baghdad and the different Sunni Arab provinces.
Now, a key factor in all this is the Islamic State, ISIS.
Yes.
And that's both a military, it's a political issue, but it's also a cultural and it's a moral issue as well. And before we go to questions from the audience here, I'd like to ask you just what your speculation is, what your thinking is if it's developed in this area. Does the United States have a moral obligation to defeat the Islamic State? How are we going to live with that Islamic State over time? Are we going to be forced to live with it?
I don't think you can live with the Islamic State. And I think, look, we have a number of moral obligations, if you really want to look at it that way, in Syria. I mean, there's 300,000 Syrians that have been killed. Half the country's population has been displaced externally or internally. The infrastructure has been destroyed in many, many areas. And you have this very, very kaleidoscope of different groups fighting there. But really what we have is a strategic obligation. I mean, the Islamic State is a threat, not just to the region, not just to Europe, it's a threat to us as well. I mean, we've already seen ISIS-inspired events in the United States. They're very, very good in social media. This is a huge difference between them and al-Qaeda. We still have a strategic imperative to defeat al-Qaeda as well. When we have made actually enormous progress after the senior leadership of al-Qaeda, which is located in the western mountains of Pakistan. So I think that's how I would put it. We have moral obligations in a lot of places. I don't know that you can honor every single one of them, if you see what I mean. Yes. I mean, there's a limit to what, but that catastrophic situation, I think, does demand more action. And I think, again, you have a strategic imperative to defeat ISIS.
General, would you like to take questions
Sure,
from the audience?
Absolutely, yep. And I think we have some great ROTC cadets going to move the microphones around. Hey, Joe, how are you?
Good, sir. How are you?
Good.
Nice to see you.
What's the valuation of your startup now?
$2 billion.
It's unbelievable.
Thank you.
Really extraordinary. Congratulations. I knew I should have invested 3 years ago.
I have some shares in your name, don't worry. General, I'm curious if any existing theater commanders call on you for advice and what advice you give them in the event that they do. And second question is, I'm really looking forward to reading your memoirs or book if you should ever decide to put those in writing.
A lot of people ask for advice. I have given some of that publicly, as you may have seen. I testified for 3 hours solo before the Senate Armed Services Committee. I think it's the first time in a very long time anybody has testified by himself who's not in government. And I mean, look, there's a ton of other people. The White House does certainly ask and listen. A number of people there, folks in the Pentagon. I just saw the Secretary of Defense the other night, saw the Chief of Staff of the White House the other day. And so again, there's and there are a number of others, and certainly certain commanders in the field. Almost every commander out there served multiple tours in Iraq or Afghanistan when I was privileged to be the commander there. I obviously have still a lot of insights, I'd like to think, at least about Iraq in particular. And so, yes, and and I try to help them in any way that I can. I don't have any ideas about memoirs anytime soon. I'm sort of focused on the future. Well, certainly not, you don't forget the past. You never, and in fact, one way you don't is you support veteran service organizations if you're in my shoes. So,
thank you.
Thank you. Yep. Right there.
Sir, just a couple questions.
One per customer. Try to make it one if you can.
Well, just real quick, J.C. Guest, 1st Battalion, 5th Marine State Platoon.
Oh, you get 3 questions.
MBV Cohort 2. Just your opinion on General Mattis. I know,
Mad Dog Mattis?
I know how we all saw him. I just wondered how you guys in the upper
man.
echelons may have viewed him.
Oh, no, a great man. He was a great partner, we fought to Baghdad together as division commanders. We came back as 3 stars together. Gosh, he replaced me as Central Command commander when I went to Afghanistan and was my boss. He was still there when I was at CIA. Oh, no, it would be an understatement to say that I've got a lot of time for Mad Dog Mattis. Beyond that, I have enormous affection for him, and he's a great friend.
And then just real quick, General, going back to kind of how the speech started, there's a theory that Lincoln set up the whole Fort Sumter thing as in an effort to entice the South to create conditions whereby the North could then justify going into a war that not everybody had an appetite for, and then with the expectation of creating a second national bank, and then after that going into things like suspending habeas corpus and those things. If those things were proven true, would that change your opinion on how you view Abraham Lincoln?
I don't think they're true, so I guess it's hard to imagine it with all due respect. I know there's an awful lot of sort of novelist history out there, and it's very interesting. There's some that have written, how the war ended very differently. But Lincoln was truly an Olympian figure, if you think about it, and think of the times that he went through, think of every night he's in there at the telegraph machine getting these, and he's got the lives of all these soldiers on his hands, massive casualties. He had demonstrations to deal with. Remember, there were sort of draft riots or whatever. Again, he could have lost that re-election had it not been for Sherman taking Atlanta, and then really sealed it when Sheridan had the decisive. By the way, that victory that Sheridan did, he narrowly arrived back in time. Remember the timing. He was actually in Washington for some kind of big powwow there, and somehow gets word that there's something going on, and he races back to the front, literally just in time to rally the troops. Again, the personal presence and example and direction and energy and inspiration that commanders provided in those wars was quite extraordinary. And they'd have horses shot out from underneath them, they'd have bullet holes in various accoutrements and so forth. So again, at the end of the day, I just think Lincoln deserves the unbelievable reputation, really an extraordinary reputation that he has. And I still draw inspiration by running up into the Lincoln Memorial and reading the various phrases and excerpts from his speeches. Really a inspirational figure. And we're so lucky to, at that time, that moment in time, you look at, and remember, he had not had the longest of political careers prior to that time.
Just one last thing.
Sure.
So how do you think that affects the concept of nullification? Because did the Civil War just end the idea of nullification?
I'd let you debate that one with a guy who knows more about that part of it than I do. Thanks, though. Semper Fi. Right, can we get the mics over here? Right there? There you go.
How you doing, General? Hi, Professor Starr. How you doing? Alan Takagi, 231st Signal Battalion. I have a question regarding the decision after we took Baghdad, disbanding the senior Iraqi leadership.
Yep.
And how that decision brought ISIS into power.
Well, we didn't just disband the senior leadership. We fired the military, and we didn't tell them what their future was. Now, there were 2 catastrophic decisions made for which there was some reason to make it part of the decision, but when you didn't have the other element, they proved to be absolutely, again, catastrophic. First was the firing the military without telling them what their future was. Again, there was going to have to be some demobilization of Saddam's army. It was a jobs program for generals. A lot of people joked. It was huge, much bigger than it needed to be. but you don't just tell them they're all fired and let them wait for 5 weeks to find out what their future is. I mean, what we announced when they were fired, this massive army of many, many divisions, that we were going to build 7 battalions over the course of the next year or two. So all the rest of them, and by the way, of course, they all took their weapons home with them when the army sort of melted away. And so we were confronted by massive demonstrations. If you were anybody on the ground in that period of April, May, I guess it was, of 2003. And in Mosul, we'd already had our first election. We actually had a governor, we had a provincial council. This thing was going swimmingly. We were doing investment banking deals for hotel refurbishment, and we had truck stops, and it was extraordinary what was going on. I had a deal with Turkey for electricity, a deal with Syria, oil for electricity. We were going to town. And this thing just cut our knees out from underneath us. So now, every week we're dealing with increasingly big protests that ultimately end up with fatalities outside Baghdad and Basra. My worst nightmare was that somebody in that crowd was going to shoot around, and I would be up on the wall shouting at them through a megaphone and getting the leaders in and saying, okay, I'll take your concerns to Baghdad. And about 4.5 weeks into that, I flew down to Baghdad, found the guy that was responsible for that program, and said, your policy is killing our troops. You got to announce what the future is. They have to have stipends. We've got to take, we found $1 billion or whatever it was of Saddam's money all told. Now let's put it to use. Then the second, of course, was the firing of the Ba'ath Party down to level 4 without, again, a reconciliation policy. You had to do some de-Baathification. Very 2 top levels. Look, I'm very proud that the 101st Airborne Division, frankly, killed Saddam's sons, Uday and Qusay. They were murderous, lecherous, horrible individuals. And that level, these guys needed to be, brought to account. But you get down to level 4, I mean, you had 120 tenured professors of Mosul University that were level 4. And we're trying to reestablish Mosul University. It had about way over 20,000 students at 18 colleges, trying to rebuild this thing, and they fire all of our tenured professors. Now, they had to be level 4 because a lot of them had gone to school overseas, and that's how they make sure they come back or something. I mean, these were our kind of guys, actually. Again, Western educated, half of them drank. I mean, what a refreshing discovery. And we fired them, and in their place, we got generally Islamist folks that replaced them. So that was another catastrophic decision. In Mosul, I got Ambassador Bremer to give me personally, special dispensation to allow reconciliation commissions. And it was a huge success. It was massive. And so we had things back on the straight and narrow again. We'd resolve the military thing. They had stipends. So we're moving back. We're gathering momentum again. And then ultimately, a few months into that, the head of the De-Baathification Commission in Baghdad refused to accept our reconciliation committee recommendations. For example, the 120 professors, almost all of them would at least get a job back. You have to have people, they have to have an incentive to support the new Iraq. If they're thrown on the ash heap of history, thrown out of their house, out of their job, out of everything, why are they going to support the new Iraq? And they didn't. They became part of the insurgency. So those were catastrophic decisions. They were real strategic blows. Right here? Or right there would be fine. That's easy. And then you can go to the one right back over there afterwards.
I'm interested in what your opinion is of the impact of the loss of the draft following Vietnam, the impact on the country and the military.
It's a great question, and I part with some of my peers on this. To fight the wars that we have fought, frankly, you'd want to do it with a professional force. The amount of time required to master the technology, the complexities of what we do nowadays and all the rest of that, you can't have the kind of drafty army of 2 years or less. Beyond that, I didn't want people in uniform that didn't want to be there, frankly. You know, you're going into battle, you want guys that actually raised their hand and took an oath, and they're going to support the guys on their right and left fiercely. And, you know, what was paradoxical is that we had very high re-enlistment rates during this time. And the largest re-enlistment ceremony in history was in Baghdad. I was the administrating officer reciting the oath. They'd say it after me. 1,215, largest ever. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and I'm looking out at them. This is before the economy's gone down. There's no sense. It's at full employment and everything else. July 4th, 2008. And, you know, I'm looking out, what is this all about? And I realize this is all about, number one, they feel very proud to be serving a cause larger than self, quietly proud. They feel privileged to do it with other great Americans on their left and right. They don't want to let them down. And they know that the country's behind them, even if they may disagree with the policies that sent us to war. And that's a pretty powerful combination. It was really an extraordinary moment in this former palace of Saddam's to be doing the largest re-enlistment in history. So now, on the other hand, was there something good about a draft and national service? And that's really, I think, what you're getting at. And undeniably, I think, certainly some countries do this to great effect. Israel would be one of them. Germany did to a degree, but it kept shortening the period of the draft so much that it really was starting to be questionable whether they were ever learning the military skills and could actually be effective. So I'm all for voluntary forms of national service and what they provide. I don't know that I'm one that would support, you know, just the massive bureaucracy. We could never do, remember the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Depression. I mean, if you tried to do that nowadays, you know, you'd have to have 50,000 physicals up front. You'd have to have national insurance. You'd have to have the occupation safety and health people would never allow you to do it without, you know, you can imagine the bureaucracy that would be created around this. And beyond that, you're taking people out of the workforce for a certain period of time, perhaps with the idea that you're going to get something unifying and good out of that, to be sure. And so, you know, I love Teach for America. There's a whole host of these, the Peace Corps. There's a number of others. I think there's a code for America now, or there should be. I mean, that just to produce STEM skills and so on. So that's sort of where I come down on that. And again, I recognize that I'm not, you know, pounding the drum for national service. I just can't get there from here in a particularly rational way. But thanks for the question. Right back over there.
Hey, good evening, General Chase Millsap. I served under your command as a young lieutenant in those dark days of 2007 that you mentioned, specifically on a military transition team where we did build the relationships with the local security forces. And then with the rise of ISIS and, you know, really a collapse.
When did you leave in 2007?
I was there, I got there in June and actually met you in Taji in August.
The briefing
right before,
yeah.
Yes, sir, right before you left to go back and explain what was going on.
Well, you saw in what area of the country were you in?
We were up in Al-Qaim, so right on the Syrian border.
So you saw a transformation, actually.
Absolutely, night and day.
Because that's Anbar province. That's one of the fought-over provinces now and all the way out on the border. In fact, Al-Qaim is still in ISIS hands.
Absolutely. And by the time we left, you mentioned it, it was really quiet, totally different. And my question is, you know, we built these relationships, real personal relationships, you know, forged through battle.
Yep.
And, you know, we're finding that some of these security forces have now turned and become refugees. Some are hiding in their homes. Some of them are facing some serious fights right now. What is our moral obligation to them? And how do we rebuild the trust that we really are partners?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, we rebuild it by doing everything we can to help them regain control of their country, defeat the Islamic State, and so forth. The truth is, what Iraq needs is a campaign that has all the components of the civil military counterinsurgency campaign that we and our Iraqi partners carried out, but with some very big exceptions or differences, that the ground forces have to come from the Iraqis. They really do. If not, it's not sustainable this time. And so you can delay it a bit if you have to, and we have, to make sure that you have forces that can hold what it is that you're going to clear. And then the reconciliation component, which was so important, the Anbar awakening had already taken place by the time you got there. Bringing the Sunni Arabs back into the fabric of society, that has to be done by Iraqis this time as well. We can't do it We don't have 160,000 troops on the ground. We owned Anbar Province. If I decided we were going to do reconciliation in Anbar Province, we could do it. I was Baghdad, at least for that part of the country, and we did. And that's what we did. My very first trip was out to Ramadi to see the small instance of reconciliation that started back in October 2006. And I said, this is what we got to do. We'd done it in 2003. Again, it had never been sustained. So now, as the obligation, I think you have almost levels of obligation. I think we have an enormous obligation to those who have been truly jeopardized in their safety by working for us, our translators. We had lots of local translators. I just reunited with my translator from 2003 because when I went to Mosul, I said I want a local Iraqi graduate student to be my translator, and it was very, very valuable. But like a lot of others, he had to leave the country, and by golly, he's not just managing a bank, he's managing a whole region of banks in California. I was going to say out in California, but in California. It's wonderful. And he came and we met in New York a few months ago. But those, I think, and then from there's a number of others, but I think those are the ones we have a true moral obligation because they served for us, with us, in many cases wore our uniforms with perhaps an Iraqi flag on it. And we owe them a lot. The same, by the way, in Afghanistan. I can say that nobody's signed more letters to the customs folks in Washington, I think, than I have. So, again, you can't take all the world's problems, but there are some that I think we have an obligation to take. So, right in here, please. And then we'll come back. Are there hands over there? Yep, all the way in the back, please. Go back there. Yes, sir.
Thank you, General Petraeus. My name is Nolan Melson. I'm a former faculty advisor, U.S. Army Sergeants Major Academy. And I'm calling on your memory to ask, what do you think the efficacy would have been from an international political strategy had we not, or chose to, not disband the armed forces of Iraq after the initial Persian Gulf War? And the reason I bring this forward is that my cousin, Lieutenant General Calvin Waller at that time, spoke to me candidly.
Great man, yep.
That he felt that we should have kept tighter control and forced the international coalition to remain in place to work with the Ba'athist government without disbanding the army upon threat upon reinvasion and occupation, that we would have gained something, maybe not something permanently, but at least if you can see an extrapolation into the townships and the provinces of our presence.
Sure, yep.
And I just have one more little thing for you. This is from my study of military history. I can't find anywhere where a certain amount of appropriations were set aside during the Civil War after Lee surrendered at Appomattox based upon the entreaties of various leaders in the southeastern portion of the United States who were deadly afraid of the destruction that had been rained upon the dikes, the handmade levees, the infrastructure down there with the hurricane seasons approaching. I mean, they had capitulated, but they expected the federal government now to be responsible for helping them repair and be prepared for the next storm season. Just an A-side, but I've never been able to find anything myself.
Yeah, I must confess, that's
Thank you, sir.
One beyond my knowledge. I've looked very closely at Reconstruction for what it's worth, because it's a really fascinating, extraordinarily difficult period. People forget that Sherman and Sheridan and others like that literally went down and took over entire states, forced governors and state parliaments and legislatures out. I mean, it was just an unbelievable period that we have somewhat taken the rearview mirrors off. And sadly, a lot of what happened then, of course, really then led to, better part of 100 years until we had the Civil Rights Act in 1965 and so forth, in very tough years. I don't remember us actually disbanding the Iraqi military after the Gulf War. In fact, what I do remember is actually Saddam's army putting down would-be Shia revolts in various places in the south.
Sir, they did not disband, but there was a desire not to effectuate control. Maybe I should have clarified myself.
Well, I don't. Again, I think there were some errors made that generally folks agree on. That actually they shouldn't have allowed Iraqi helicopters to continue to fly because they actually were brutal in what they did to the Shia population. And you'll recall for, a better part of a decade, we had no-fly zones basically to enforce in the south and in the north protecting the Kurdish areas, the south protecting, again, what he was trying to do to some of the Shia and also perhaps do something in the region. I don't, there's a huge debate about should we have continued on and not just stopped at Kuwait? Should we have actually destroyed more than we did? Because we had, huge pockets of them that we eventually let go back into Iraq. And I think it's going to continue to be fought over. There's just so many what-ifs there that I don't see a particularly clear path in either of the different opportunities that we might have had. And of course, there's even, quite considerable discussion about what we ultimately did in 2003 as well. So, and I think there's all the way in the back there, and I think we will probably have to make this the last one, I'm afraid.
Thank you, General. First of all, thank you for your service.
It was a privilege.
My wife is here. She served under you in Serbia and Bosnia.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you for that. Great experiences.
My question to you, sir, is congratulations on a wildly successful transition from military to civilian to private sector. And just from hearing you speak tonight, you were able to draw some parallels from your military and your civilian service and bring it into the private sector in terms of responsibilities of leaders, setting a strategy, communicating it, overseeing implementation, then repeat the process. For those of us who have served, I'm a veteran myself, I know there's a lot of us in this room, I had a hard time being able to draw parallels between that experience and what I was able to provide to the private sector. And it's probably taken me the better part of 12 years with the company I currently work for before I could really synthesize that and be able to sell it to somebody and move forward. How did you accelerate that process, and what advice do you have for veterans in the room today so that they can repeat that? So I guess what I am saying is, how did you do it, and can you tell me?
Well, it sort of helps to have a few high-level positions and then be director of the CIA, I guess. Actually, what you described is something that's hugely important. And in fact, one of the great things KKR does is we support a jobs hiring fair at least every year. In fact, we have a program called Vets at Work. In fact, I'm the chairman of that as well. And we've hired over 30,500 our portfolio companies. We're invested in, if you add all the different types of companies that we have, I think we have 115 or 120 companies around the world. And those that are in America have hired over 30,500 U.S. veterans in the last 4 years alone. And we just did one, well, thanks. Now, we just did one of these down in Fort Worth, Texas. As a matter of fact, we had 85 employers there, 85 firms. We had hundreds of veterans and actually spouses and some still serving members who are beginning to transition, and also 12 veterans service organizations. The point I have continually made gets at what you're talking about, and that is that we don't just want our veterans to be able to find a job, we want them to be able to find a career. And that's a two-way street, and a lot of that has to do with the employer really investing in the veteran, recognizing the unique experiences that veterans have had, truly unique, the extraordinary values and attributes and discipline and cool under fire, literally, and leadership and teamwork and everything else. But then be willing to invest in them because, if you've been an infantryman or a tanker or an artilleryman, there's not necessarily a direct corollary, legal corollary in the U.S. civilian economy. And so I think that's actually, we owe our veterans, again, not just a job, but we ought to invest in them as well. And by the way, we believe strongly that it's not just the right thing to do to hire veterans, it's the smart thing to do from a business perspective. So that's something we worked very, very hard on, and a couple of the veteran service organizations on whose board I sit focus on this by mentoring or a variety of other activities. But that is the key. I will also add that great universities like USC have gone to great lengths to take care of our veterans. Now I think we have the Yellow Ribbon program in every single school, and so if it's not, thanks Regina, I mean, not that I was sort of a squeaky wheel on this, but you know, if you didn't want to get called out by the general at USC, then please supplement the GI Bill so that all their expenses are covered. A variety of other actions were taken because the veterans are different. You know, they tend to have families and little kids and wives at work, and so they've got to get their course schedules sorted out. They've got to get a variety of other issues. We had a veterans service center now and so on. But that's hugely important. And USC also has this wonderful program where if you graduate from the community college, you get in here. And so my hat is off to President Nikias and the faculty here and staff for doing an extraordinary amount for our veterans. And by the way, for keeping ROTC on campus throughout the Vietnam War and a variety of other great initiatives. So it's one reason that I'm very, very pleased to be a Judge Widney professor here. Thanks. And thanks again for what you did, what your wife did, and thanks to all of you for what you did here.
General,
thank you very much.
It's 6:30. It's 6:30, we're on time. It's going to take me a little time to recover from the 120 tenured professors fired at the University of Mosul, and I hope the Vice Provost hasn't listened too closely to that.
Just the Bath Party members.
And General, it's been a privilege to have you here. We all feel we know you because of the conspicuous role you played in our nation. And you're welcomed to a period of time in the private sector, but we look forward to your return to the public sector.
Well,
and the
you
Judge Widney professor is a nice transition to that.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.